I asked Antonio before coming here, what I could do to attract the attention of a sophisticated Ivy League audience. And he said, you really can't miss with pictures of cute animals. So this is a picture of some monkeys that I saw when I was visiting Southeast India a couple of years ago. I was staying at a guest house. I took the photo from the balcony. And as you can see, they look pretty adorable. But it turns out these monkeys have a dark side. Because if you leave your room, I discovered after a day or so, and you leave your windows open, they'll come inside and they'll trash the place. And things aren't always what they seem in other ways as well. Even though this setting looks pretty sleepy and pretty out of the way, at least to my Western eyes, there are not only monkeys, but there are deer running around. There are these magnificent banyan trees. It's on the edge of a national forest, this location. It turns out that these monkeys are in the middle of the campus of the Indian Institute of Technology at Madras, which is part of the network of elite engineering schools all over India. It's often called the MIT of India. And despite appearances, this out-of-the-way campus is very much connected with the global network of knowledge and talent mobility that makes up the new global higher education marketplace. It's a college where you go to visit the director, and he's just back from Davos, where he's taken place in a higher education working group headed by Rick Levin, the president of Yale. It's a university where you sign up for job interviews with Google and McKinsey, same kinds of places that come here and recruit at Dartmouth. It's a university where you see posters advertising graduate fellowships at KAUST, the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, a brand new university in Saudi Arabia that's seeking the best and brightest students from all over the world. So one of their stops on their recruiting tour, of course, is the IITs. And as I was working on the Great Brain Race, I came across unexpected and I thought quite fascinating scenes like this all over the world. But the truth is that's not what I was expecting at all. I had in mind a very different kind of book. I thought I would do a sort of series of profiles of the great universities of the world. And that's what I set out to do. But after a few months, I started wondering, why was the director of a place like this going to Davos? Why was Google coming to recruit these students? And I sort of realized that with my initial idea, I was missing a much more important story. And that's the story that I eventually tried to piece together and tell in the book. And it's about how the old order of elite universities around the world is very gradually being shaken up as a new era of really intense global competition gets underway. Now, this afternoon I'm going to give you just a taste of what I discovered. And I'm going to focus on 3 of the hallmarks of this new global marketplace. Now, the first is academic mobility. The second is the rise of university rankings all over the world. And the third is the quest everywhere to create world-class institutions. Now, for each of these phenomena, I'm going to spell out all of the fascinating things that are happening, how they've combined to make higher education globalization reach further and spread more quickly than ever before in history. I'm also going to discuss, in each of these 3 cases, how some people are wondering whether certain aspects of this new university marketplace might represent a threat, something to worry about. But for each of these big 3 trends, I'm going to tell you why we don't need to worry. Why this transformation of higher education around the world is a huge opportunity. An opportunity for nurturing talent, an opportunity for, for expanding meritocracy, and an opportunity for fostering innovation, both for the West and for the rest of the world. So, I'm going to start with academic mobility and just talk about what's happening. We're witnessing mobility of faculty and students around the world to a degree that we've never ever seen before. Now, of course, there's always been international student mobility, going back to the first Western universities in the Middle Ages. Students would travel from places like Paris to Bologna to Oxford. This is the time when we had this notion of the wandering scholar. But of course, since then, the trend sort of, went back and forth over the centuries, but it really exploded in the second half of the 20th century. And if you look at this, this chart showing the recent numbers, you'll see that there were 3.7 million globally mobile students in the last year for which we have data. And these are from the OECD, by the way. That's an 85% increase from the 2,000 students that we had, the 2 million students we had in the year 2000. Dartmouth is very much a part of this world of mobility with, I believe you have a 7% international undergraduates, 5% faculty members who are foreign born. You have many, many students going overseas. So there's a tremendous amount of mobility, especially in some fields and at high levels. You have something like half the world's top physicists who no longer work in their home countries. These are really very significant numbers, and it's probably not surprising that recruiting for these students is very fierce. Of course, for top PhD students, these are the students who are really the backbone of the world's research labs, PhDs and postdocs. So the top students are really fought over. They can write their own ticket. They can go all over the place. With undergraduates, there's a mixture of motivations. Of course, undergraduates, foreign undergraduates often pay full fees. There are places that are not like Dartmouth and don't have the same financial aid for foreign students as for domestic students. Places like the UK and Australia depend very heavily on the revenues they get from foreign students. But I think it's easy to be very cynical about that aspect of foreign students. Yes, students pay fees, but also foreign students, I think, bring really valuable talent and resources to the campuses where they study. And I think countries and universities that are smart really understand that these students represent a resource, not just a revenue source. So recruiting is very fierce. You all know that social media is the big thing now to try to attract students. And this was true even a few years ago. New Zealand decided to create the sort of higher ed promotion agency, a viral video to recruit students from the Asian student market. And it was extremely successful, although it was withdrawn pretty quickly after it was put out. And I'll show you just a still from the video. Look carefully, it's a hot tub. And of course, you see a pair of students, kind of making out in the corner. And then you have to imagine when you see the whole video, which I won't impose on you, but the camera pulls back, of course, to show the disapproving parents over in the other corner. And of course, the caption is, "Get further away from your parents." And very innovative, a bit controversial, it got pulled, but you can see it had a lot of impact, because if you look at the recruiting figures over 10 years, New Zealand really did very well. So, if Dartmouth is looking at strategies, I think it just tells you being a little bit edgy, being a little bit creative, sometimes can get results. So, I've talked about mobility of students and faculty. There's lots of other kinds of mobility. We have mobility of research, and there's just incredible international networks of research collaboration. There's been a doubling of global research collaborations in the last 20 years. In fact, I think those numbers are probably even higher now. You just find examples all the time. In Brazil, 30%, which is a real rising research power, small but rising. 30% of all their articles have foreign co-authors. You have networks where students will come and study, for example, in the West, and then they may go back home, but then they will collaborate with the professor they studied with. So you have these networks that are constantly expanding. So mobility of research, and then you have mobility of campuses themselves. And by that I'm talking about the so-called branch campus phenomena, where universities, typically Western universities, have set up branches in the Middle East and often in Asia as well. And these are also growing quite quickly. There was a report that came out in January finding there are 200 branch campuses around the world. And a few years earlier, although with a slightly different definition, there were the count was 162. So they've been growing pretty quickly. This is a branch campus that I visited on the edge of Doha in Qatar. And excuse me, when most people think of Texas A&M University, this probably isn't what they think of. But Texas A&M has a branch in Qatar. It's part of a complex outside Doha called Education City, where you also have Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and several other American institutions, I think one British institution, one French. And it's a really lavish complex. There's marble all over the place. No expense was spared. It's all been paid for by the Cutteries through something called the Cutter Foundation. And it's really an interesting place. You walk down the hallways and you'll see a men's prayer room on one side, women's prayer room on the other, with a washing station in between. You'll see a lot of women in abayas. But then you'll walk down the hall and you'll see the Starbucks, and you'll see the subway. And of course, you see men and women studying together, which doesn't happen across town at Cutter University, where they have separate classes. And what I was really struck by was I saw posters all over the place advertising a debate series with a very controversial debate resolution about whether Gulf Arabs value profit more than they value people. And it's just the kind of thing you wouldn't expect in that region. I mean, Qatar's not Saudi Arabia, but neither is it a Western democracy. So these institutions, I think, have been invited in part, I think, to try to push the envelope a bit and to try to create some of the conditions of sort of free public debate that we take for granted here. So there's various kinds of mobility, students, faculty, research, campuses themselves, and there's also quite a bit of anxiety about this mobility. And there's a number of examples, but I'll just cite a couple. One is brain drain. And this is this fear that's been around for a number of years, particularly in the developing world, that young people will leave to study in the West and they won't come back. And sometimes, people have taken measures to stem brain drain that I don't think are very wise. The director of one of the IITs, actually, they still call it IIT Bombay, north of Mumbai. A few months after I was in India, he basically said too many students were going to the West for internships, to study, to work. He was worried about losing all this talent, so he said, you can't go. You're not going to get credit unless you stay close to home. So keeping all the best minds close to home. So there's a converse concern, especially in the West, that talented foreigners will somehow come in and crowd out domestic students, or when they graduate and they work here, they'll crowd out domestic workers. And we have what I call in the book academic protectionism, but it's really, a lot of it's about immigration policy. And you've seen this in Australia, for example, where there were concerns that foreign students were coming, many from India and Asia, to study at vocational schools that weren't really legit. So there was a crackdown on that, but as a result, they made it much harder for legitimate students to come in, and they eventually reversed that policy. France, similar thing. They were, just last year, they had some big restrictions as part of an immigration reform that were going to make it much harder for foreign students who graduated to stay on and work. They also ended up reversing that. And here in the United States, we have, of course, many foreign students at our institutions, but we have a very limited number of visas, so-called H-1B visas, for talented foreign workers, meaning that it's hard for many students with advanced degrees to stay on after they graduate. And in fact, President Obama talked about this in a speech in El Paso last year on immigration. And he said, today we provide students from around the world with visas to get engineering and computer science degrees at our top universities. But then our laws discourage them from using those skills to start a business or a new industry here in the United States. This makes no sense. So there are a lot of anxieties around the kind of mobility I'm describing. But I really think that it's very important that we embrace these kinds of developments, that we not worry about them. We're now in a dynamic higher education world. It's not a static world. The old patterns that we kind of think of still are really changing. So yeah, there's no question that brain drain remains a concern in a number of places. But at the same time, we're seeing new patterns. Now you hear much more about brain circulation. Sometimes people talk about brain exchange to capture how different the patterns are. If you look at patterns of study and work, for example, Indians and Chinese may study in the US, may take another degree in a different country, and then go home to work for a multinational. A great example of brain circulation at the faculty level is this guy, well, you don't see him, but you see his journeys, Chunfang Shi, who's originally from Singapore, came to the United States for graduate school, got a PhD in mechanical engineering at Harvard, worked in industry, became a tenured professor at Brown, extremely successful. So far that's a classic sort of post-war trajectory from the developing world to the West, and a very successful career. But then the National University of Singapore is trying very hard to really to become a great world-class university. They recruited him back to NUS, where he returned. He headed up an important research institute, and then he got promoted and he became president. So that's a complete reversal of the patterns we think of. And then to add a new twist, when KAUST was started a few years ago, KAUST recruited him, that's number 3, KAUST recruited him to become their founding president. So he moved again. And, excuse me, you know, I would not suggest that an example like Chun-Fang Shi is typical of the mobility we're seeing, but I do think that he's emblematic of the kind of possibilities that exist in today's world. And, you know, just briefly, this notion of crowding out students, I think there just isn't much evidence of that. You know, there was an interesting study showing that in certain key periods when PhDs were, foreign students were flooding into certain PhD programs in this country, many of the programs just expanded. You know, it wasn't as if there had to be a finite number of slots. So I don't think there should be much worry about that. And of course, we have to remember that so many of the talented students who come to the United States become a huge asset, you know, to our economy, particularly in places like Silicon Valley. My employer, the Kauffman Foundation, has done studies about the very high percentage of firm founders or co-founders in Silicon Valley, these high-growth firms who are immigrants, and many of whom had come to the United States through our universities. Well, the bottom line here, I think, is that mobility is empowering. You know, as we bring down protectionist barriers in immigration policies, a world of academic mobility lets people get ahead based on what they know, not based on who they are, where they come from, what their family background is. This is what I call, in the book, free trade in minds. It's really the principle of meritocracy, and it's hugely important. So, excuse me, I've talked about the ways, you know, in which a highly mobile worldwide education marketplace has developed. And, you know, I think that education markets, like financial markets, other kinds of markets, really need information in order to function. So perhaps inevitably, the mobility of students, of faculty, of research, of campuses has been accompanied by a proliferation of college rankings, not just nationally, but globally. So let me just talk a little bit about how this growth really began. I'm going to go back more than 100 years to my hometown of Berkeley, California, where the very young University of California had started 15 or 20 years ago. This is 1895. This is probably my favorite ranking slide of all time. And it's a little hard to read, but what this is a ranking of physical fitness. And what you'll see is that it shows the young men of the University of California, and they measured, you know, their necks and their chests, and they looked at their strength and their thighs and everything they could do, and they compared them to actually for the social scientists here, a very impressive sample, 15,000 East Coast blue bloods, you know, at Amherst, at Cornell, at Yale. And, you know, the California guys were behind at first, but after a couple of years of, you know, calisthenics in the brisk Bay Area air, and you can see their wonderful calisthenic outfits, they surpassed at least the initial figures for the guys from the East Coast. And I love this for a couple of reasons. I mean, well, it's just funny, but one of the things, of course, is it does tell you that our impulse to rank and to sort, I think, is not something new. It's not something that was created by U.S. News. And I have Jay Matthews, who writes for the Washington Post and who created the Newsweek rankings of high schools, says human beings are tribal primates, which means that we are by nature you know, designed to sort and to rank and to figure out who's the alpha, you know, where people are. But the second reason I like this is because it actually is sort of a precursor of the value-added movement, which is so important in today's education debate in K through 12, but also increasingly in higher education. It's not just how good were they, but how much better did they become after they were enrolled for a couple of years. So there were a number of rankings throughout the 20th century, nothing though really big and significant. So fast forward to 1983, that's when US News created its college rankings. First, a simple survey of college presidents, eventually became more sophisticated, obviously very controversial. What I didn't know when I was at US News is that since US News created the rankings, more than 40 other countries have created their own national level rankings. And these are not just the places you might expect, you know, Canada, Italy, the United Kingdom, though they all do have their national rankings, but places like Nigeria, Peru, Kazakhstan. They all have their own rankings. There's been a real interest in this kind of thing, and there's been so much interest that global rankings were created. The first big one was by Shanghai Jiao Tong University in 2003, very heavily focused on science and research. The next one by a British publication, Times Higher Education, the following year, a more survey-based ranking covering more fields, and these quickly became very popular. You know, not only with students, I should say popular, they became closely watched and controversial with students, with universities, and with policymakers. And I'll show you just the most recent ones, if I can get this up again. These are the top 10, both from Shanghai and from Times Higher. I'm sorry, there is no real ranking for excellent liberal arts colleges that also have excellent graduate divisions in a few areas, or maybe I should say many areas. But you know, what I'm always struck by is how there's always a few more British institutions in the Times Higher top 10. But you know, what I think the real interesting question is not so much the top 10, it's what happens in 40 or 50 years. You know, given the sorts of changes that I'm going to be talking about, I think that once you get, maybe not the top 10, but in the top 30 or 40 or 50, I think you're going to start seeing some more new names, new places, as institutions that have not been on top start improving and start becoming much more competitive. Excuse me. So rankings are this huge phenomenon, but they also worry a lot of people. And I mean, I could talk, you know, for a long time about why people don't like them, but you know, I think one of the big criticisms is that they're arbitrary, that they focus on the wrong factors, that they create perverse incentives, and they just don't tell you how effective universities are, especially when it comes to really core activities like teaching and learning. And of course, if you really hate global rankings, you can just create your own. This is what happened a few years ago when one of the French engineering schools decided that it wasn't happy with the global rankings, and they came up with a different methodology. I think that's my second favorite ranking slide. So there's a lot of concern about rankings, but once again, I think rankings are ultimately very useful. And yes, it's absolutely true. Rankings have many flaws. I mean, you know, it would be hard to deny that. But I really do think that rankings have the potential to be helpful to students, to universities, and to government policymakers, really fundamentally because they provide an external yardstick that allows us to compare universities and to spur competition and ultimately to help us improve. You know, rankings provide sort of a common academic currency. You know, I was visiting England when I was working on the book, and I met a chemistry graduate student at the University of Warwick. She's from South Africa. She had done her undergraduate in South Africa, and she wanted to get a PhD at a different country, at a really good program. She had no idea, you know, what a good program would be. So the rankings were part of her process. They weren't the be-all and end-all, but they helped her figure out some of the top places and where she should, you know, start doing more research and making contacts and making an application. That's just a very practical example. You know, I think we have to sort of sometimes step back, I think, from, you know, some of the, you know, there are issues about, you know, well, is number 16 really that much different than number 17? And, you know, those are all very legitimate criticisms. But, you know, there's a researcher in Germany that has another kind of ranking, different from the US News. But he says that rankings are a democratic instrument. And the reason is because rankings provide, you know, transparent information to consumers. And I think this is something that we should really welcome. You know, the other thing to understand is that rankings are not going away. We're in the age of accountability. So rankings will be done. The question, it seems to me, is will they be done well? Can they be done better? And I think I'm optimistic on both fronts, but there's more work to be done. I think there are some encouraging developments. The OECD, based in Paris, has an initiative called AHILO, which is the Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes. And it's really an effort, it's really in the very early stages, sort of almost pre-pilot, but they're trying to make cross-national comparisons of something that we don't really hear enough about, which is how much are students learning. And so they are actually borrowing an American test, the Collegiate Learning Assessment, and giving that to students in different countries, and seeing, well, how much better does your writing get during college? How much better do your analytical skills get during college? And they've chosen some subjects, economics and engineering, which they think will perhaps transfer reasonably well across national boundaries. And they're doing some work on those as well to try and create testing instruments that can be used in different countries. That's just one example. There are many other initiatives. The European Union has a new ranking initiative that kind of lets you build your own ranking based on the criteria that are most important to you. And I don't think there's a single best ranking, but I think it's great that we're seeing this kind of ferment, because I think that, as I said, transparency and accountability are just so important in higher education. They're important in this country too, and I think that's inevitably going to be what happens around the world. Well, for all the controversy that we've seen over global college rankings, we do know that many countries are using them to assess where they stand in their quest to build great institutions. And this brings me to the third, and I think the most significant trend that I'm going to tell you about, and this is the race to create world-class universities. Many nations, I think, are correctly understanding that a thriving university system is the pathway to innovation, the pathway to economic growth. And I always like this quote from a wonderful book that came out a few years ago from a couple of Harvard economists, husband and wife actually, Claudia Goldin and Larry Katz. And it says that human capital embodied in one's people is the most fundamental part of the wealth of nations. And I think that's what everybody is realizing all around the world. And I think countries understand that their competition is not just regional or national, that it's global. And they're not content just to send students overseas. They don't want to just bring branch campuses to their own soil. They want to build their own. They want to create their own great institutions. And they're doing that in several different ways. They're spending a lot of money to become more competitive. Excuse me. China has not only quintupled the number of students entering its universities over the last decade, it's also spent billions to improve its universities. It's focused a lot of attention on a select number of universities that are sometimes called the Chinese Ivy League, because they want them to be globally competitive. In Saudi Arabia, I've mentioned KAUST. King Abdullah spent $10 billion on KAUST just to get it started, which meant that it instantly had the 6th largest university endowment in the world. Countries are also changing the way they spend, how they spend. Places like France and Germany that had a very egalitarian ethos in their funding of universities have now created various initiatives, Operation Excellence. France has something called, Operation Campus, the Big Loan. They've created various mechanisms to try to funnel more money to institutions that can show their research is competitive. A lot of this is focused on research universities. So spending is a big tactic. Recruiting is a big tactic, the same way it is in the States. You want to build your institution, you need the best talent. So China has done a lot to recruit overseas Chinese professors to come back to China. It's more appealing to live there than it once was, certainly. The economic conditions are much better. They're offering quite generous packages. And they call these people sea turtles. I don't speak Chinese, but apparently sea turtle is a homonym in Chinese for a returnee, somebody who goes back home. So the images of sea turtles swimming back across the ocean, back to China. So recruiting is a big tactic. And the third thing universities are doing is trying to create partnerships. Singapore is a great example of a country that's been very eager to do this. They really want to become a global academic hub. So the government has brought in lots of foreign universities, including places like MIT, Carnegie Mellon, the University of Chicago Business School, Duke has a medical school in Singapore, and there was not long ago, I think it was the year before last, Yale and the National University of Singapore announced a partnership to have an undergraduate liberal arts institution within the National University of Singapore run by Yale in partnership with NUS. And I think this is significant to this audience in particular because it reflects the huge interest in liberal arts education that now exists in Asia, in China, in Hong Kong, in South Korea, obviously in Singapore. You know, the liberal arts tradition that has been such an important part of this country's institutions, particularly at the elite institutions, is seen, I think, by places like China as a key to our success in creativity, in innovation. The idea that students are taught to, forgive the expression, it's overused, think outside the box, question authority, be analytical. I think there's a lot of concern in Asian countries that students, we may admire how accomplished they are in the so-called STEM fields. We see a lot of their strengths, but they look to us and they see the kinds of capacities that are going to be more and more necessary. And so it's not that this is spreading everywhere, but I think there's a lot of interest. And so Yale's move over there to create this partnership is certainly a part of that. So world-class aspirations, spending, recruiting, partnerships, all of this is going on, and it's creating, once more, a lot of anxiety. Well, why are people worried? I think that, in a way, if you were to sum it up, in the West in general, and in the United States in particular, there's a fear that we're losing our edge, that we're no longer going to be number one. When it comes to Chinese and other Asian universities in particular, it's become quite common to fret, or some people even panic about this sort of alleged peril, either educational or economic or both, that is posed by the enormous number of science and PhDs that those nations are producing. President Obama sort of touched on this in a sort of unfortunate way, in my view, in his State of the Union address last year, when he talked about the idea that we're facing a Sputnik moment. And of course, a Sputnik moment has a lot of resonance, in this country, and it sort of implies to me a sense that we are under threat, that there are sort of sinister foreign forces that we should be worried about, that we have to be sure that we don't get, that we don't get beaten, that we don't that we don't get left behind. And it's not just the United States. Ian Gao, who's a British academic who was the founding president of the University of Nottingham's campus in Ningbo in China, he was interviewed by a newspaper, and he warned about partnerships with Chinese university, and he said those partnerships are a one-way street, that they're intended to vacuum up Western science and technology strengths that China really is desperate to gain. And then he was quoted as saying, "British institutions must stop viewing this aggressively ambitious country through rose-tinted spectacles." So, if others are getting ahead, this reasoning goes, we must be falling behind. Well, the good news, I think, is that this kind of alarmism is really badly misplaced. We should be embracing these kinds of changes, and we shouldn't be fearing them. And yes, it's quite true that Western institutions are beginning to get a run for their money. But I really believe firmly that we should embrace this global higher education marketplace, because increasing knowledge is not a zero-sum game. Knowledge is not a finite resource, like gold or diamonds. It's something that can grow. It's something that can expand. And I think this kind of apprehensive response that we sometimes hear to what's happening in other countries in their university systems, it really amounts to a kind of modern-day mercantilism. And that's this sort of outmoded idea in economics that in order to prosper, a nation has to grab on to the maximum share of a finite amount of global capital. And really nothing could be further from the truth. So here's a great example of how our store of knowledge can grow. This is from a UNESCO publication that came out about a year and a half ago. And This is about the sort of geographic distribution of scientific publications. And basically you can see that from 2002 to 2008, in a fairly short period, the US share of publications fell. It actually fell more than any other countries. So that sounds terrible, right? They're eating our lunch. The sky is falling. But of course, if you look at the overall increase in publications during that same period, American scientists published 46,000 more scientific papers, which is huge. Well, the pie got bigger, right? It's not a zero-sum game. So yes, we had a smaller slice. We had a smaller slice of a bigger pie. So increasing knowledge is not a zero-sum game, and what's more, knowledge is a public good. It can't be contained in one country, and that's great because it means that research advances in one nation can be used by academics and innovators all around the world. I'll use an example from the author Amar Bide, who wrote in a book called The Venturesome Economy a few years ago. A Briton invented the protocols of the World Wide Web in a lab in Switzerland. A Swede and a Dane in Tallinn, Estonia, started Skype. And then he concludes, how did the foreign origins of these innovations hurt the US economy? So when we in the West hear all about the smart people in China who are earning all these PhDs in these key fields, we should understand this is good for us. It's not bad for us. We really need more well-trained minds, whatever their origin, working on the big problems in science, in technology, in healthcare. It's not a matter of vacuuming up knowledge. It's about spreading knowledge. Well, I've talked about several aspects of the great brain race. Mobility, global rankings, this quest to create world-class universities. Well, here's what I want to leave you with. As we look to the future of global higher education, the entire us versus them paradigm of university competition is increasingly out of date. We already have research collaborations, as I've discussed, all kinds of partnerships across borders. In 50 years, Nigel Thrift from the University of Warwick says, in 50 years we might see outright mergers of universities. We could see the university equivalent of multinationals. John Sexton, the president of NYU, which has created a whole undergraduate campus in Abu Dhabi, headed by Al Bloom, by the way, the former president of Swarthmore. John Sexton, talks about the idea of a global network university, where students might start their studies in Abu Dhabi, and they might finish in Shanghai, where they're now building another campus. They might start in New York City and finish in Abu Dhabi. We just don't know what's around the corner. Remember that in the 19th century, Americans flocked to Germany to study at the first research universities, the so-called Humboldtian Research University, with teaching and research combined under one roof, free from government interference, this core principle of academic freedom. Americans studied that model, they liked it, they came back and they founded institutions like Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago. We took that model, we copied it, and we perfected it. After World War II, we became by far the best in the world. And despite all the forces of competition I've talked about, our research universities at the top levels are still head and shoulders above the rest of the world. So Germany, as I mentioned, their egalitarian funding system, they've had a pretty rotten university system for decades for a number of reasons that I won't get into right now. But the Germans, as they try to create a more competitive system and they try and create some centers of excellence, they're looking to the US model as a model that's going to get them into a better place. So it's come full circle in 150 years. A lot can change pretty quickly. But one thing that won't change, I believe, is that the key to innovation and the key to economic growth in the future is going to continue to lie in the freest possible movement of people and ideas in universities and beyond. Now, just one final anecdote that has sort of stuck with me. Last year, around this time, I was visiting the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I picked up a campus publication that had an interview with a Chinese student named Mandy Chan. She was a computer science major. And they asked her whether she was going to go back home after graduation. And she was very pragmatic. I mean, she said that was a possibility, but the quote that really grabbed me is this. She said, "Wherever there is an opportunity is where I will be." And that really sums this up. I think it's a very exciting time, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next. So, thank you.